Hey, it's Mike. Thanks for tuning back in. Got a lot of comments about Jack Morris in response to the two Chris Sewell interviews or collaborations I did earlier this week, or the one that I broke up into two videos. I want to talk about Jack Morris extensively here because I get a lot every time I mention Jack Morris and how I don't think he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. I get a lot of comments, and I would like to just point people to a video where instead of going back and forth with them in comments, I can just say, here's my argument, and then they can respond to this. If you're new here, I'm normally a baseball card guy, but I also am a massive fan of 1980s and 1990s baseball, and Jack Morris just doesn't make the cut for me to the Hall of Fame. Now, I want to be clear. I think Jack Morris was a good pitcher for a very long time. We're going to go through all the arguments and why I don't think they hold water. I'm actually going to turn this a bit so I'm more centered. There we go. Really, the only argument that holds water for Jack Morris is that he was a clutch pitcher in the World Series. He had two good World Series, and that's just not enough. Kirk Gibson doesn't belong in the Hall of Fame, even though he had two big clutch World Series home runs in 84 and 88. This just doesn't hold water as an argument for Jack Morris. Now, I mentioned WAR. Jack Morris's WAR was 43.5, I think, 44-ish, which doesn't cut it as a starting pitcher for WAR. A lot of people don't like WAR. Fine. It probably means you don't understand what it does and how it works, which is also fine. It's complex. It's not easy to understand. So I wanted to just break down all the statistics that go into a typical Hall of Fame argument and why Jack Morris isn't good in any of them. Now, in the 80s, pitchers pitched a lot. That was the way it was. Good starting pitchers pitched a lot of innings, and Jack Morris certainly did. He was durable, which was important. There's no taking that away from him. He had a very good career at 44 WAR. So I don't want anybody thinking that I'm saying that Jack Morris was a bad pitcher. He was not. He was a very good pitcher for a good 12 years or so. His best 2 years, we're going to stick with WAR for a minute here. His best 2 years in pitcher WAR were 5th place in the league. Now, that's not bad for sure, but you would think a Hall of Fame pitcher would have more than 2 5th place finishes in pitcher WAR in a season. That's not overall WAR, that's just pitchers. His career ERA at 44 is the same as John Lester and Javier Vasquez, two very good pitchers that don't belong in the Hall of Fame. ERA, 3.9 ERA is the highest in the Hall of Fame. Somebody's got to be highest. I'm not taking that. I'm not saying being the highest is bad because, like I said, somebody has to be the highest. I just don't think you should get voted in a century into the Hall of Fame, roughly, as the highest at that point. It should be somebody who was voted in early and then things changed, or you were a 3.9 during a really high ERA era and you were voted in because you dominated in a high ERA era, like, I don't know, somebody who was a very good pitcher during high ERA. But that's not Jack Morris because he was in a low ERA era, lowish anyway. It certainly wasn't the 90s, the late 90s. So ERA plus is a good statistic that measures your ERA relative to the league average. It also, I think, factors in your park and things like that. His career ERA plus was 105, which means he was 5% better ERA-wise than the league. That's not great. That's basically league average. Same career ERA plus as Andy Benes and AJ Burnett. Two guys who don't belong in the Hall of Fame. So ERA plus, ERA, these aren't great. ERA isn't a great statistic. It's a good one, but it's not great. The best season Jack Morris had was 133 ERA plus, 33% better than league average. Pretty good. That's a solid season. You'd want to string together a lot more than one of those, though, for Hall of Fame. To give you a little reference, Pedro Martinez's best year was a 291. And Pedro Martinez's career was at a 154 ERA plus. Now, you don't need to be Pedro Martinez to make the Hall of Fame either, but you've got to be better than AJ Burnett. A lot better than AJ Burnett. Walks per strikeout, or strikeouts per walk, I should say. He was at 1.78, which ranked him during his era 214th out of 612, not even in the top third of pitchers of his era. Strikeouts per walk. A lot of people cite his postseason heroics. I mentioned this briefly. Let's talk about them. 84, 87, 91. He was very good in those 3 years. 87, he only made one start. And ironically, I guess, 87, he lost that one start. And I would say he pitched quite well in that, even though he gave up 6 runs. He kept them to low base runners, which is what you would expect from a pitcher. 1991, great. Amazing season. I'm not taking that away from Jack Morris. I remember watching that World Series live, Game 7. Amazing, amazing performance. 1992, won another World Series. He went 0-3 in the playoffs. Gave up 19 earned runs in 23 innings. He had a 1.7 whip. It's not good. 1993, he was so bad that season, he didn't even pitch for the Blue Jays in the playoffs. Still collected a ring, though. Wins, he had a 57.7% winning percentage in his career, 192nd all-time. Not great. He had 254 wins in his career in an era when starting pitchers won a high percentage of their games or got decisions in high percentage of their games, unlike now when the relievers collect a lot more of the decisions. He only won 48% of his starts in his career. You think, wow, he won a lot of games, he was winning a lot in the 1980s, but he didn't even win half of the games he started in his career. In the 1980s, did he lead the league in wins in the 1980s? He sure did. There's no doubt about that. He only led the league in wins once that year, and it was in the strike-shortened 1981 season when he won 14, tied with 4 other pitchers for the league lead. 1980s. So if you say, well, he won the most games in the 1980s, you also need to make that same argument for guys who peak in various other specific decades. So let's say Roger Clemens peaked from, 1988 to 1997. It's a bad example because Clemens had all kinds of different peaks. But you take a guy who peaks in 1994 to 2003, nobody would ever say he won the most in the decade starting 1994. But because Jack Morris peaked exactly roughly 1980 through 1988, 1989 wasn't good. 1988, people cite that as a very important statistic, and it's not. Here's the other top winners in the 1980s. Oh, by the way, he was 25 years old in 1980, so it makes sense that he would peak in that year. His win-loss percentage in the 1980s was exactly the same as his career win-loss percentage, 57.7% win-loss. He had a 1.26 whip in the 1980s. Whip, WHIP, is walks plus hits divided by innings pitched. It's the number of base runners you give up per inning. 1.26 is mediocre. It's okay. Only won 49% of his starts in the decade, which is not good. 162 wins, which was the number of wins he had in the 1980s, would be 8th in the 1970s when there was a crop of much better pitchers who peaked during that decade. Top 10 in the 1980s, Dave Stieb, 140, 22 wins behind Jack Morris. Dave Stieb was a consistently much better pitcher than Jack Morris. He had a 56 WAR. He had much better ERA for his career, much better whip, just played on much worse teams, unlike Jack Morris. And we're going to talk about those teams too. Bob Welch, third place, 44 WAR, same as Jack Morris. Then you had Fernando Valenzuela, Charlie Huff, Bert Blyleven, who started his career in 1971, I think. And then Nolan Ryan. Nolan Ryan closes out those top 7 guys in the 1980s. There's nobody in there that had their peak around 1980 to 89 like Jack Morris did. Now, fielding independent pitching is a way basically to eliminate impacts of fielders. So it's kind of preventing home runs and walks and striking out guys. So it looks a lot like ERA and acts like ERA. His fielder independent pitching in his career was never top 5, not a single season in the top 5. Let's talk about the 1980s and the Tigers. 1980, the Tigers scored the most runs in Major League Baseball. So, yeah, he's going to win some games on a team that scores the most runs in Major League Baseball. 1980, they were 15th in Major League Baseball, middle of the pack. It was also happened to be his best season back when he won those 14 games and led the league. He had a very good season, 3.05 ERA, 1.16 whip. That's 3.05 ERA is good. It's his best ERA for his entire career. 1982, back to 8th place. So now, they're one of the top offensive teams. 1983, they were 4th in the league in runs scored. He's pitching for the best offense in baseball over the course of the decade. 1983 was his second best season, 3.34 ERA, again a 1.16 whip. 1984, they were the best team in best offensive in baseball. Best offense in baseball. 1985, they were 10th. 1986, they were 3rd in baseball. 1987, they were 1st in baseball. 1988, they were 8th in baseball. 1989 was Jack Morris's worst year on the Tigers, and both pitching-wise and his record. And they were also a bad offense. And his record really suffered because the offense wasn't there to pick him up. He had a bad season pitching, which would have been covered up in prior years when their offense was better. But he went 6-14 that year because he didn't have the offense to bail him out. As I mentioned, he had no season better than 3 in the ERA, but he had 8 worse than 4. A lot of people say he pitched to the score. And to that I say, what does that even mean? Does that mean he just went out and he was like, I don't need to pitch well today. I'm gonna create risk for my offense and not pitch very well and let them score some runs because it seems like it would be fun. If you have an explanation for this, let me know, because I hear that a lot. Jack Morris pitched to the score. But it doesn't hold water. It makes no sense. Somebody in my comments very, very nicely made an argument. He said that Jack Morris, first of all, he said Jack Morris started in 10 or more All-Star games. It was actually 5 All-Star games that he pitched, or he was elected. But using All-Star games as your argument doesn't really hold water either, because it's a popularity contest. And Jack Morris was popular in the 80s because he was winning a lot of games, and that was important in the 80s. If you had a guy now who was winning 20 games, leading the league in wins, but had a 3.9 ERA, people would be like, he's not very good, he's just on a great team. We are more enlightened today than we were in the 1980s about what makes a good pitcher. And that's why Felix Hernandez won the Cy Young, I don't know how many years ago that was, 15, 12, I don't remember. And what was his record that year? Like 13-12, 14-12. 5 All-Star games, by the way, same as Travis Fryman. He only started 3 of those, which is great. He started 3. He was picked as the starting pitcher, but it's still not amazing for a guy who won the most games in the 1980s. Everybody knew he wasn't the best pitcher every year. Never was the best pitcher. He peaked at 3rd in Cy Young voting in the 1980s when he was supposedly the best pitcher in baseball, but never won the Cy Young. The same person also argued 14-time opening day starter, which is great. He was not the best pitcher on his staff most of those years, though. At least many of those years. And if we're going to say most times starting a season, is he better than Pedro Martinez, who didn't start that many? Roger Clemens only started 13 opening day games. There are a lot of guys below 14 that were much, much better pitchers than him. He just happened to be the guy that they said, yeah, he can probably go 7 or 8 innings for us and only give up 4 or 5 runs. So in 1984, the Tigers team, he was the number 1 pitcher for the team. He was considered the number 1 pitcher, but Dan Petrie was actually better. 1991 for the Twins, when they won the World Series, Kevin Tapani and Scott Erickson were better pitchers. He was the 3rd best pitcher on that team. Kevin Tapani's WAR was actually 2 wins better than Jack Morris's. But because he won more games, he got more lucky. And wins, a lot of luck goes into wins, you guys, whether you like it or not. 1993 with the Blue Jays, Jimmy Key and Juan Guzman were better pitchers than Jack Morris was that year. I was a big Juan Guzman collector as a kid. I loved Guzman. And Jimmy Key, you can't say enough good things about Jimmy Key. So that's the basis of the argument. He pitched for great offenses, and he won a lot of games. He was very durable. He was a very good pitcher for a long time. But none of the arguments for his enshrinement in the Hall of Fame hold up. And I'm open to your comments. Let me know in comments what you think. It's fine if you disagree with me. The guy that I had this comments back and forth with was very respectful. I expect you to do the same. If you disagree with me, just explain to me why you think I'm wrong. All right. Thanks very much for watching.